Hey folks, Philip B-Man here. I'm going to do my best to persuade you now. This is a follow-on to my previous video on 8 or 9 frame boxes. I'm going to now convince you that 10 frames is the perfect number. So, I know this is, from commercial beekeepers, this is unorthodox thinking. From probably a startup beekeeper, you're thinking, what's the big controversy? It's a 10 frame box. Why wouldn't you have 10 frames in it? So if you're not sure why I think this is something that deserves attention, you can go back to my previous video on 8, 9, 10 frames. So here's my pitch for 10 frames. First, in the field, you got to save time wherever you can. You're out in the field, you can only see so many hives in a day. Every box you don't have to space is time saved. And I think that the 9 frame guys tend to admit that because a lot of them use self-spacing frames or the frame rates. I showed you that before, right? And they say, look, I can get all the benefit of your 10 frame box by putting this spacer in, and so I don't have to space them manually. The frames will drop into those holes. Checked on the prices. By the time you buy 2 of those frame rests, you're well on your way to buying the extra frame anyway. So if it's the economic argument is I can save money by not having frames, I can have one less frame in the box, but I'm going to have to buy a spacer in order to make that work. I think that's, you're talking pennies difference by the time you get them installed. My time in the field is the most valuable commodity I have. I've got to make that work. And when I kind of thought about the time I save in the field, not spacing versus the extra time I spend extracting, my opinion, that kind of washes out. Yes, it's going to be probably going to be an extra day of extracting over the season by the time we add it all up. No problem. The high school kids are happy to have the job. And when I'm out on a Sunday afternoon throwing boxes on myself to try to keep up with the flow, the fact that I don't have to space them, great. But the real payoff is when I'm pulling honey with the easy loader and we can drop 2 boxes on in a single movement while I'm standing there with that expensive machine doing nothing and the time it takes to put those boxes on. The faster those boxes go on during the honey pull, the more I can do in a day. And so I believe the time investment, you got to save time working the bees. If that costs you time having an extracting crew, I'm happy to take that trade-off. I also think that when you have a 10 frame box, the chances of a misspacing resulting in burr comb or bridge comb is when the bees on the 2 frames are side by side and they'll build a little bridge across. The tighter those frames are together, the less bridging there is, and which is not a big deal in itself, except it's nearly always that bridge comb and burr comb that results in misfeeds on my uncapper, which can sometimes damage the frame. Stops the process, it's got to be fixed. So if I can reduce the amount of burr and bridge comb that are in my supers, there's actually a productivity payoff for that. And I think that might be part of why I didn't notice a huge extracting cost to going to 10 frames, because I think the actual process, the efficiency of fewer misfeeds in the uncapper offsets the extra frames. I haven't measured that, so don't quote me on that, but that's my instinct on that. But certainly my frame breakage did go down when I went to 10 frame boxes, significantly down. We used to have a pallet or 2 at the end of the year of broken frames, and we're down to a few boxes. I also feel that I'm cutting less wax, and let me talk about that a little bit. So when you have your extracted, and both of these frames have been through my uncapper, and you can see a bit of the residue of the knife cut there. You have to cut at least as deep as the shoulder. If the frame is not cut or scraped or whatever, to the width of the shoulder, in my extractor, the frames spin around in the extractor shoulder to shoulder like this. If I don't have that space trimmed down, the honey can't flow out between the frames into the extractors. If the frames are too fat, then they'd actually kind of smother each other and not drain properly. So you got to have your knife set thinner than that shoulder anyway. So the idea that you're saving a ton of that somehow the uncapper is going to work better, I don't really quite get. I think what you want is the knife to be set basically the width of the top bar and not the width of the shoulder. You can see the top bar is inset from the shoulder. And so that's the right depth to cut your foundation. And so you're definitely cutting that depth just to have your extractor work properly. So any wax sticks out past that depth is ending up in your wax melter or in your cappings pit rather than in your back out in the field. And wax is expensive, and it's not only is expensive to buy, but it's expensive for the bees to make. They will metabolize honey to produce the energy to make the wax. And I can't say I've read original research on that, but the numbers I've seen quoted in various authoritative textbooks is about 5 to 1, 5 pounds of honey consumed to produce a pound of wax. So every pound of wax you don't pull off of your frames is 5 pounds of honey you'll eventually get out of your system. Usually the payoff is in subsequent years, right? They have to build less wax the next time. They can't build as much because they can't make that frame too fat. So they build just enough, cap it off, and then you just basically skiff off that same amount of wax every year with your uncapper, and that you can minimize the amount of wax you're cutting. Minimize the amount of wax you're cutting, minimize the amount of honey they use to make new wax. I spoke in my previous video about bruising or leakage of the combs when those shoulders are tight together and the wax is shorter. Pick these up again. So you can see that these two frames side by side, you can see right through them. And if they were tight like that, the bees would basically build the wax out to the width of the top bar and then cap it off. And then no matter what happens, those frames can bang each other shoulder to shoulder. They can be like passengers in a New York subway station just banging into each other with their shoulders all day. And that capping never gets damaged. And then when those boxes come to rest in your hot room, that's my hot room is where I'm standing right now. Which is actually cool. Today it's a cool room because the heat isn't on yet and it is stinking hot outside. But the wax doesn't bruise, it doesn't leak. That honey ends up in your extractor instead of on your hot room floor. And anyone who's had to clean up a hot room, will realize that that's not nearly as much fun as you might think. Now, here is the deal breaker for me. We tend to think of supers as things that hold honey. I suggest to you that a honey super is really a honey evaporator. That's where the bees put the nectar and turn it into honey. The honey super doesn't just hold the honey, it helps make the honey. And just as a 9-frame box has one less bee space and can hold more honey, its total storage capacity is greater. But the evaporative capacity of a 10 frame box is 10% larger than a 9 frame box. And so I ask you to think yourself, is my honey super a bucket to hold honey, or is it a radiator the bees use to evaporate the nectar to turn it into honey? And when you realize, yeah, actually that honeycomb really has an important job to do in the hive. It's not just an inert thing, that it actually is part of the process. You'll go, yeah, actually, I can see why the bees would appreciate 10% more surface area as they're working so hard to push air through that hive and to dry that honey. So I contend that a 10 frame box will be slightly more efficient for the bees. Since the bees do all of the work and I'm just kind of coming along and stealing it once it's done, I say the bees are in charge here and they should get what they want. So for me, I'm now a dedicated 10 frame man in my honey supers, and I don't know, I guess, there'd be you'd have to be a very carefully controlled experiment to prove that in the field it makes that much difference. You'd have to have side-by-side hives. That would be, you'd have to have, because I'm not thinking it's a huge effect. I might be wrong about that. I'm thinking it's probably a subtle thing. I think it matters the most right at the onset of honey flow, when you might not have quite enough boxes on yet. The bee, and maybe even the honey flow catches you a bit off guard and you're not quite ready. And the bees, they can't fill a comb full of honey. Each one of those cells, they got to put, remember, these are jars that are on their side. Turn your honey jar over, even on your table when it's thick honey. How much does it hold? Not very much. The bees are trying to fill honey jars on their side. Which are just slightly angled up. So they put a drop of nectar in. And they've got to evaporate that down before they can add more. So that can lead to a lot of beekeepers misjudging how much empty space they need on their hives, because, there's only a couple pounds of nectar in this box. Why would I give them another box? The bees can be plugged up on very little nectar when it's very fresh. So you'll need to keep in mind not the total amount of the honey they're producing over the season, but how much open comb do they have to store single drops of nectar to hold that fresh nectar as it comes in. You remember when it shakes out? Doesn't take much before it would just spill right out. So total surface area of comb at the onset of honey flow, reducing swarming, making sure the bees have enough capacity to be fully efficient, I suggest to you is underappreciated by most beekeepers. I never ever want to tell folks how to run their hives. Please don't ever take me to be saying this is the only way. I think that there's good reasons for both. I'm just telling you my thoughts on why I use 10 frame boxes. I appreciate hearing from you what you think, and whether I've made a case now for 9, and I've made a case for 10. I'll let you decide for yourself what's best for you. Thanks a lot, everyone. Have a great day.